downlink that something ridiculous had happened on the launch. We had expected two big solar arrays to come out. It turned out that, think about a soup can with a label, although I don't know if soup cans these days have labels, but if they do, think of running your fingernail right down the side of the soup can and the label just peels off. And that's what the atmosphere did to this thermal micrometeoroid shield that Bob just mentioned. And on the way off, the label ripped off one of the big solar arrays, and by chance, a piece of aluminum strapping held the other one down to about a 10-degree or so displacement. But we got enough little bit of sun in that we could tell that it was still there. The other one got ripped off and there was nothing coming out of it. But that one was clearly there, so the first hope was to get that raised so we could get some energy. But we also saw the temperatures in the lab screaming upward because the thermal shield was gone. And what became immediately obvious within hours after the launch was that temperature rise, we're going to have to do something to stop that. The ground crew, the mission control, tilted the spacecrafts in relation to the sun to try and minimize the solar radiation on it and the temperature increase. But to do that, they had to keep firing the reaction control jets. The momentum gyros wouldn't take it, so they had to keep using up a consumable to do it, and it became being caught in a coffin corner between running out of fuel or keeping the temperature in bounds. So it was immediately obvious that we had to do something really fast, or there was $20 billion disaster on our hands, something like that. And so I took off in a T-38 from Kennedy here within hours after we realized that something had to be done, and headed for Marshall Space Flight Center, where we had the big mock-up underwater in the neutral buoyancy tank. And I had spent half of my life there. I still got webs between my toes from all the underwater simulation with the Skylab. And the big question was, what in the world could we do? I handled EVA because on Apollo I did an EVA with the first suit that was worth a damn, namely the first Apollo spacesuit. The Gemini suit was a ridiculous piece of stuff, saying it nicely. And so I had a very successful mission EVA experience on Apollo, and therefore I became Mr. EVA and developed all of the procedures for Skylab. So I was sort of the logical one to look at the possibility of doing something EVA on Skylab that would substitute for the thermal shield. Now I'm going to shorten this because I'm going to simply tell you, if you really want the details of that development that I did underwater there to develop what we call ultimately the twin pole sail, or the spinnaker, which we eventually put down. Jack is going to tell you a little bit about that, deploying that, but I'm going to bypass it just by saying that I landed over there probably 6 hours after the Skylab 1 launch, and I didn't sleep for about 3 days. I had a team immediately that was responding to me there. Anything, this had to be who could design it but an astronaut, right? Who'd been doing all the EVA development. So, within a matter of getting over there after hours, we had to come up with a design and start building it, because while we canceled the first manned launch the next day, obviously, we only could get up to it every 4 days. That is, we had a launch window every 4 days. And it was pretty clear at that time that the temperatures were going to be out of control. All the food was going to be ruined. The onboard film, You know, we got a lot of people in this room probably don't know what a film is. We didn't have any electronic sensors to look at the sun. We literally had these humongous film canisters the size of a big Samsonite suitcase that we had to replace and put out. That was the normal procedures that I was developing. But we had nice handholds and all kinds of things going where we needed them to get that job done. But all of a sudden, we had this task to do, like working on the side of an elephant. You know, there were no handholds. There was no way. Well, the question that was facing us, was there some way we could do something? So I got in the water tank as soon as I got over there to Marshall, and I'm not going to belabor it, but let me just say, Deke Slayton called me while I'm going down underwater, getting weighted out. It takes, you know, you got to put weights on your spacesuit and all that, so you're neutrally buoyant. But I'm down about my neck in water, and the guy at the control panel hands me the telephone, says it's Deke Slayton. Okay, what the hell do you want, Deke? Deke says, you in the water tank? And I said, yeah. He said, get the hell out. And it was like, what? I said, come on, you gotta be kidding. I gotta get answers to this. We gotta start this work, you know? I said, why the hell should I get out of the water tank? And he says, we got word that the press is coming. I thought, my God. Yeah, we got a $20 billion program, and he's worried that the press is going to get wind that we're trying to save it? I mean, I said, Deke, I'm sorry, we just got cut off. And I handed the guy the phone and told him to hang it up. And so we got back to the weights, and as I went down about here in water, you know, going down, the guy picks up the phone again, and he's pointing at me and he's saying, it's Deke again. And I said, tell them we're underwater. And I went down, hang up. So for the next hour, I was underwater, and we're trying to figure out how the hell we can do this. Now, I'm going to cut this short and say, if you really want to know about this, the important thing is that for half of my team, which was anybody I wanted, I mean, there were no rules that were followed. This was emergency, $20 billion disaster on our hands. Anything that can be done, you do it, whoever you are. And that was the attitude, and it was not just the team there, it was the whole country at that time, the whole space component, contractors, everything. You wanted anything, you just called, asked for it, people would ship it from Seattle overnight on the CEO's plane, I mean, anything. We had guys that didn't sleep for 72 hours or more, 4 days or so. It was an unbelievable effort, and we knew we had 4 days that maybe we could save this thing. Ironically, we were ready in 4 days, barely. We could have made it, didn't have to, because the guys in Houston had another alternative that they were using, and for reasons which you can look up, it had to be tried first before, because ours could go over their idea of a sunshade, but theirs could not go over ours if we went first, and it did work. So that's the story of Skylab. Now, what I'm going to tell you now, I'm going to break and say what I'm going to tell you about is a few things in my memory of Skylab which nobody knows about and are really kind of fun. Okay? Now, one of them is that, after my Apollo 9 flight, I wanted to thank the world for this incredible privilege that I had in flying in space. And so I did a lot of community things, volunteering. And this was, 1969, 1970. This is the whole era of, the peaceniks and San Francisco and the people getting into drugs, kids getting into drugs, and their parents not knowing what the hell was going on and what to do with them. And so I had started a crisis hotline in Houston, and I was doing things with other organizations. And everybody was trying to do something about the drug scene. Their kids were all smoking marijuana and other things. And parents were angry about it, didn't know what to do about it, and nobody could speak to anybody. So there were organizations trying to do things, and they decided to pick on me to be the honorary chairman of the Houston Committee on Drug Abuse. And so I did that for a while, trying to get people talking, but it was interesting because the Beatles had just met in India with a guy named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And he was touting transcendental meditation. And the idea there on his part was, hey, you don't try to pull the kids out of where they are, you help them to go through it to this. So meditation is the way you want them to go through. I said, well, that's an interesting idea. So I started to become a transcendental meditator, right? And I got to know Maharishi and hung out with him, not like the Beatles, but I pal around with him a bit. He was a really interesting guy. Turned out he had studied physics at university. And so he was totally fascinated with space. So let me show you. We have slide number 1. There you go. There's Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in the Skylab mock-up at Trainer in Houston. And how many times has NASA shown that picture? Okay. Break. Number 2. We were starting to fool around with the Soviet Union at that time and thinking about some cooperative stuff. And so in a series of exchanges, it turned out that Buzz Aldrin was going to be a host to take around the U.S. space facilities a couple of the recent cosmonauts who had flown. Andrei Nikolaev and Vitaly Sebastianov. And they had just flown in the spring of, or in the summer of 2020, 1970 was, right. And in October, they landed at Dulles. Buzz met him, and he was going to show them through. I happened to be a marshal in that time, and I was doing some development work on the Skylab. And after Washington, Buzz was bringing them down to Marshall. And I was finishing up some underwater work a couple days, and I planned it so that on a Saturday morning, I would have one last thing to do in the water tank to figure out. It was legitimate. But I called Buzz, knowing that he would have these 2 cosmonauts with him, and I would be showing him the underwater facility, training thing in a water tank. And there was a catwalk way up that you could walk around the thing. It was a narrow, about as wide as this chair. And it ended at a porthole where you could look in and see the whole thing. And I knew that I would be there showing them, Buzz would be there, the 2 cosmonauts, a translator, and the head of Marshall Space Flight Center, and another guy from headquarters. And I figured, this is about time that we started working with these other guys who had flown in space, and we didn't know them very well. But I thought, this is a real opportunity. So I made one call. I called up Buzz, and I said, hey, Buzz, if I make an invitation to these guys to join me in the water tank tomorrow morning, I want to know if either one of them is going to accept. I said, I'll give you about an hour to get back to me. He said, okay. And I said, we never had this conversation. Okay. An hour later, he calls back and says, you got one yet and one da. I said, great. We never had that conversation either. So I said, okay, I don't want to get my tail totally in a crack here. So I figured I knew one guy at NASA headquarters, and I'm going to give him a call. And I'm going to tell you now, nobody knows this part of it. People know that they got in the water tank the next day. One guy, Sebastianov. But nobody knows how that happened. So I made one call to the head of communications under Tom Paine, who was then the administrator, and that was Julian Scheer. Julian was an out-of-the-box kind of guy. Those of you, few who might remember him. And I knew him very well. We knew each other very well, and I knew I could talk to Julian. And I said, okay, got him on the phone. I said, okay, Julian, I'm going to be showing these guys the water tank, and I'm thinking I want to get one of these guys in the water tank with me tomorrow morning, but I want to know whether, if you think I should not do that, let me know, it's done. And I said, by the way, we don't have this conversation. And I hear click. Okay, so we got all the way out to that afternoon on the catwalk. Only 4 or 5 of us could hear each other, and I'm looking in, showing them. I said, hey, by the way, I'm going in tomorrow morning. Does one of you guys want to go in the water tank with me in the U.S. suit? Yeah, da. And the guy from headquarters is going, what? You know, at the head of Marshall Space Flight Center. But nobody could say no after I'd done that. And the next morning, let's have a picture here. Okay, this is Vitaly Sebastianov, and I got them in the U.S., a Soviet cosmonaut in a U.S. spacesuit for the first time, and in a water tank. And after that, Vitaly became the champion to get the neutral buoyancy training in the Soviet Union for their program. So that was really a special moment. Now, another interesting thing about that is I flew to Houston with Vitaly and Buzz and the guys, and we were in the Gulf Stream flying to Houston, and Vitaly motions to me to go to the back of the airplane with him. I go back to the airplane with him and a translator, and he looks at me in the eyes and he says, how did I do? And I looked at him and I said, oh, great, Vitaly, you know, terrific. He said, no, how did I do? How did I perform? And it was like, that was the first time that we realized that they are graded on everything in their program. And he did it the next night at McDivitt's house as well. It was very interesting. Okay, so the final thing is a little incident that happened on Joe's flight. And Joe flew with one of the wackiest guys in the program, there's ever been there, but I'm going to say he's unique to this day, but that was Pete Conrad. And Pete was a great guy. The particular reason why it's so great here is because earlier on Apollo 12, which he flew with Alan Bean, on the moon, you see this scene here. That is Alan Bean, and he's facing a carbon cask within which is a nuclear fuel rod that's, 1,500, 2,000 degrees or something like that. And it goes into the Apollo experiment package at his feet there, and it forms the source of energy for generating electricity for the experiment package. But that radioactive rod is down the middle of this big cask of carbon to both contain the radiation and the heat. And Alan has screwed the handle on the end of it, and it's really hot, and he goes to pull it out, and it doesn't come. So he pulls harder, still doesn't come. So Pete says, hold on, and he comes over with his geology hammer, and he starts whacking on the side of the carbon cask. I'm in Alan Bean's house in Houston with his family, and I'm thinking to myself, 2 of my best friends are now on the moon, and one of them is hitting the nuclear fuel rod. It was like, this can't be. And of course, the fuel rod came loose because he hit it right, and now that package works, still working today, as far as I know. But on Skylab, we had these power modules, control modules, which moderated the electricity coming out of the solar arrays, and there were a whole bunch of these things. They were about a foot square, hard metal boxes on the side of Skylab. And one of the guys figured out that the reason we weren't getting any power out of that, and we were in serious trouble again, was that there was a solder ball loose you know, and this is weightlessness, and so a solder ball will fly or just float around, and it had gotten between two contacts, electrical contacts, and had held them open, and they needed to be closed. And so the idea was, hey, let's send somebody out there with a hammer to hit it. It can't hurt, it's not working now. The worst he can do is kill it totally, but maybe it'll knock the solder ball loose. And so I said, I got the perfect guy for it. Pete Conrad, you know. So Pete went out with a hammer. And Joe, were you on that one, or was Paul out with that? That was Paul? Okay, so PJ must have been out with it. At any rate, we read this up to Conrad, you know, we got his diagram on the little printer we had, where he was supposed to, which one he was supposed to hit, and where he was supposed to hit it with a hammer. And he said, you're kidding. I said, no, we're not kidding, hit it. And he's out there, so he says, okay, 3, 2, 1, whack, and he hits it. And everybody's looking down at Ecom, the electrical control guy in mission control. He's shaking his head, no, nothing. Tell him to hit it harder. Okay, Pete, that was great, but it didn't work. Hit it harder. He said, really? Yeah, hit it harder. Hits it again, nothing. Shaking head, hit it harder. Okay, Pete, hit it harder. So he's laughing his ass off. Pardon me. And he counts down and hits it one more time as hard as he can hit it. And Ecom goes, yay! So those are kind of fun things that you're not going to read about anywhere else. Bob, back to you. The real thing.